think it's even worse. I think it's even worse if a government is deciding that than if the internet company is deciding that. I think that's even more sinister, actually. So, but there's also interesting things that I'd like to fill in about the actual science of what's known about the algorithms, because there are thousands of people working at the moment on devising algorithms to detect hate speech, and there's, and then other people who've been working on trying to do assessments of the whole field. And what's now known, what's really clear, what's really clear. So one of the motivations behind trying to get rid of hate speech online would be hate speech that's targeted towards certain minorities, because you'd be concerned about discrimination. But what's known, and we can see this even, well, Australians are a minority worldwide, aren't they? This is what you've said about how Australians use language is a good illustration. They're not, Australians aren't the kind of minority they're worried about, because you can look after yourselves, basically. But what's now known is that the algorithms to try to process natural language, which can't really fit into a formula, are almost certainly going to discriminate most against ethnic minorities. So it's actually...
What?
Yeah, because so there's research showing, for example, a lot of research comes out of America, so that a lot of the research on ethnic minorities is concerned African Americans, but because their use of language tends to be atypical, so they tend to be more likely to have their accounts.
They're going to be picked up. They're going to be picked up because they're outside of the spectrum, because the algorithm is looking for, oh my God, that makes perfect sense. But I suspect in the long run, because, what's happening now, but in the federal sphere, there is considerable debate over here when it comes to the anti-discrimination and human rights organisations. Now, everyone agrees. I'm sure I don't need to say this, but I'm going to anyway, just in case there is, some sort of misunderstanding or a misrepresentation. Bigotry is bad. Discriminating against people, bad thing. We can all agree on that. But if it's just the case that it is genuinely slanted, it's like, well, you can say these things about gingers. You can say these things about blah, 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 but you can't say it about that. Consistency, and I know a lot, actually, not a little. I know a lot about justice administration and law enforcement. And let me tell you, consistency, the consistent application of principle is absolutely so important to give legitimacy to the rule of law. Now, if you don't have that legitimacy of rule of law, you genuinely have a totalitarian kind of thing. If things are not applied consistently, and it's all like, no, you can do this, you can't do this. People are going to say these laws are not in the interest of justice, because there must be a nexus. There must be a nexus between laws and justice. If people see the laws as unjust, they're simply not going to obey them.
Yeah. So actually, there's so many things that could be said about that. I also wanted just to emphasize in terms of this work, looking at how good the algorithms are so far. There are there's a problem, but you can't cram natural language into a formula. So I think that's an illustration of how algorithms work according to formula, sort of rigorous formula, and natural language doesn't fit into that. You need to have a look at the context. One of the worrying things about that is one of the contexts by which you might understand something which somebody has said is by looking at that individual. So you might think, oh, well, this individual, they're a nice person, they didn't really mean it that way. This individual seems to be a bit hateful. They've got a Reddit account. They're on, they seem to be quite right-wing, for example. Because one of the things I've noticed is a lot of people working in this area seem to be obsessed with trying to find hatred in the far right. They don't seem to be concerned about hatred in the far left. It's far right they're concerned about. So that's one of the problems. But the data that they're using, one of the big problems about doing research in this area is you need data. You need data you need to train the algorithm on data, and having been trained on the data, you then use it for new cases. There's a shortage of data. That's one of the big problems, one of the big stumbling blocks to research is there's a shortage of data. So if you read articles about this, disproportionately, they're about hate speech on Twitter, because the Twitter data is available. You can't get hold of the data from Facebook or from other sites. It's not available. So the shortage of data is skewing the research. So rather than, I think the politicians who are putting it forward, these people, these big tech people, they know what they're doing. They're experts in algorithms. They know what they're doing. We can use this. But suppose people themselves are saying, we haven't got the data, we need data released to do it. So it's actually inadequate to the task, and also skewed. Twitter is not, there's a big problem, but how people talk online isn't real life. But Twitter isn't even the rest of it. Twitter is just Twitter. So it's disproportionately data from Twitter. So that's a really big problem. That's a really, really big problem. And then the other big problem is that when the algorithm is trained, it's trained by humans. So a human would have to go through, a human moderator would have to go through and decide, is this hate speech? Is it not hate speech? Maybe if it's mild or severe, is it hate speech or not? Well, how do you decide that? So you'd think the human moderators would have to be trained, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Very often, they're not.
Well, the other thing is, like, there's this big focus nowadays on cultural competence, which is another weird thing in itself. But again, if you're doing it for Aussies, so an Aussie is talking to a Japanese person.
Yeah.
Well, what's
I know.
the reason I called you a bastard because I like it. He called me a bastard. Like, that really does encapsulate it perfectly. And he was so right. Like, I loved it. You know, I really enjoyed that conversation with that guy. But this is the entire problem. How are we going to police this? So even assuming that these, you know, the directors of these companies and everything else really are unbiased and they don't have their own prejudices. Yeah, like Silicon Valley doesn't have prejudices. But even assuming all of those things, how are they going to do it? They kind of can't. But we haven't even got the foundation. You haven't even got the foundation there. We haven't got proper definitions. We haven't got proper mechanisms. We haven't got.
Yeah, and of course, I just want to emphasise for the listeners that this is talking about hate speech, which is not criminal. So there are certain things which are already criminal. So it's already criminal to deliberately harass somebody. So it would be criminal for me to like constantly send you messages or to to write stuff all over Twitter. Matt Maloney is a fraud and a thief or something like that. You know, if I constantly did that, that would be criminal. It's criminal to issue death threats to people. That's already criminal. I'm happy for the law to be applied in cases where somebody is like targeting and harassment of an individual.